So welcome, everyone. I'm Janice Richardson. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of South Central Texas. So let me begin with a reminder that the League is a nonpartisan, volunteer-led organization inspired by a vision of a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. And that by nonpartisan, we mean that we never support or oppose candidates or parties at any level of government. As a chapter of one of the oldest and most respected grassroots organizations in the United States, our South Central Texas League works toward this vision in Colorado, Fayette, DeWitt, Gonzales, and Lavaca counties. That's the area that we describe as South Central Texas. And we do this by working to strengthen the tradition of voting and civic participation in our community. So tonight, we are delighted to help South Central Texas recognize Black History Month with a special Zoom presentation by Naomi Mitchell Carrier. Naomi is a teacher, researcher, playwright, pianist, composer, and actress. For the past 30 years, or maybe even more, she's endeavored to bring a fresh perspective to Texas history through performance art and education. A Harvard-educated historian and the author of Go Down, Old Hannah, The Living History of African American Texas, Naomi has family roots in Lavaca County, and I'm very happy to say she's also a League of Women Voters of South Central Texas member and a personal friend. So I already mentioned that because there are many of us here, including friends from New York State and other parts of Texas, I've used my supreme powers as Zoom host to mute everyone but me and Naomi. But when we move to the Q&A period after Naomi's presentation, we can unmute for our discussion. You do have those unmuting powers. So in the meantime, you can communicate with me via chat during the presentation. If you have problems or questions, I'll be watching for those. And as I mentioned earlier, you can adjust how you are seeing this presentation by looking for view in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that I suggest you opt for the speaker option from the drop-down menu. So with this, let me thank Naomi for being with us tonight, and let's get started. So Naomi, why don't you unmute? And meanwhile, I'll start to share my screen to show the presentation.
Well, good evening, sisters. And thank you, Janice. Janice and I have known each other and bonded probably over the last 5 or 6 years in various programs. And now we've come to this. And I must say that it is a very interesting time for us to do this program. Janice asked me if I would be interested in doing a tour of some Black communities in Houston, and I suggested that prior to any tourism, that I have a brief chat with you, an opportunity to listen to your concerns by sharing with you something that I've put together more or less as a timeline about the growth of the Texas economy, whose subtitle is Cotton and Sugar in Texas. This will be a historical perspective from the 1600s until now. And let me just preface my presentation by saying to each of you how we are responsible for what happens going forward in our country. I do believe that we're living in the fierce urgency of now. I borrow that quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, but if it was the fierce urgency of now, when he was living and before his untimely assassination in 1968, when I was a student on the campus of North Texas State University, it is certainly the fierce urgency of now, today in Texas, 2024. Next slide, please. I want to talk about the history of Texas from a perspective of the love of money and power, and how that love of money and power evolved into the agriculture of cotton and sugar. These pictures that you're seeing here now come from a National Geographic magazine that was published not too long ago. Next.
Yes.
And while you look at these pictures, I want you to know that it is important for not only our history and our historical memory to be as correct as we can document it, but we have to relate what happened in the past to today. If we cannot appreciate the past, then it is important that we may not be able to connect it to today. If you see this picture from the same National Geographic magazine, it shows pirates having fun, being gleeful, sporting out with the African women. Next. And then you will notice this 19th century trade and commerce map that features the 12 Texas rivers that fed into the Gulf Coast. Look to your center there, and you will see the island of Cuba. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean, and as such, it was like a nursery for the ships on the transatlantic slave trade from the west coast of Africa. They often would make it from the west coast to the island of Cuba, and there disembark their enslaved, the ones who had managed to survive, who were then the survivors of the fittest. Those enslaved persons now could go to North America, other islands within the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, Veracruz, or South America. But there are 12 Texas rivers that fed into the Gulf Coast. Next. And those particular rivers are where some of these enslaved were disembarked. This map shows the African diaspora map. And then you can see, you may have seen this before, the routes of the voyages, many of which left from England, Liverpool, Bristol, London, then traveled to the west coast of Africa, which was also called the Gold Coast, as well as the Grain Coast, because cotton and sugar was not grown in England nor in Europe, but it was grown on the west coast of Africa. And so as the New World embarked upon their colonial empires, it was necessary for them to have not only land that was cheap or free, but water, which made the land fertile, a source of cheap labor, which turned out not to be the Native Americans, but the Africans that were smuggled across the Atlantic Ocean in something we call the transatlantic slave trade. And then many times they were disembarked on the Caribbean islands, and from there they made their way first to South America. The slave empires were first generated in South America before North America. Next slide. And then this slide shows you the approximate number of Africans that were disembarked to the various places. You see the northern US, the Chesapeake, the Carolinas and Georgia, and 22,000 that were traveled to the Gulf Coast. And then, of course, you see Cuba and Jamaica. Next slide, please. These are the rivers that I mentioned that make for one of the most fertile pieces of land on the planet Earth, and that is Southeast Texas and Louisiana. But we're talking about Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. If you will look at your mid-right of the screen, you will see Point Bolivar, which you can take a ship from the island of Galveston over to Bolivar. You'll see Campeche there, which is where Jean Lafitte and the Bowie brothers hung out. And coming on down, you'll see Velasco and Benson's Ferry. And now you're looking at a photograph of Jean Lafitte and The Barataria Basin, through which Africans were smuggled by him and the Bowie brothers from the coast of Texas into New Orleans. They were actually sold for $1 a pound. Next. The Bowie brothers, James, who's often called Jim because of the Jim Bowie knife that he used in a fight, a sandbar fight, and his brother Resin, they were not only smugglers of slaves, as we call pirates, but they were planters, inventors, mercenaries, and also served in the Louisiana House of Representatives. Next. These two maps are particularly interesting because the map on the left shows each dot that equals 1,000 bales of cotton. You don't see any dots in Texas. This is a map from 1821. So just hold it there on that slide for a while. I talk about what was the interest in settlers wanting to move to Texas, this huge land that was so fertile, and because cotton was being grown on the East Coast, many of those farms were being worn out from a lack of crop rotation, and a lot of people were going into debt and wanting to have a place to move to. So let's think about 1821. The cotton gin was invented in 1793. It was patented by Eli Whitney, and a slave woman also helped him with this invention. It was a hand-generated crank process, little machine for removing the seeds from the cotton. Well, by 1800, there had been some improvements made to this cotton gin. And by 1821, even more improvements had been made to the cotton gin, the process of removing the seeds from the cotton, which meant that if you could produce a crop of cotton, then you could grow more cotton, remove the seeds faster, and increase your yield much faster by 1821. From 1793, the invention of the cotton gin, to 1821, the year which Stephen F. Austin landed on the coast of Texas to take up his father's agreement with the Mexican government. Of course, the Mexican government had a revolution against the Spanish, and there was a lot of internal politics going on in Mexico. However, the Mexican government, as it was in 1821, welcomed Stephen F. Austin and several others into Texas in order to control the Indian population. They welcomed them to come to Texas and colonize in that state, which at that time it was not called Texas. It was still the Republic of Mexico. It was until 1836. But then if you look at the 1859 map, look how many dots equal 1,000 bales in the state of Texas. There are so many dots across the state of Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama until it's just completely black. And then you see the legend there that is in the map on the right that says under 200%, 200 to 499%, over 1,000% is where you see Virginia, North and South Carolina. And those are bales of cotton that are grown in that state. And the reason I present these maps to you is because I want you to have a complete understanding of the growth of the Texas economy and why it was very dependent upon the culture of cotton, the agriculture of cotton. Next slide, please. And so how profitable was the agriculture of cotton? Well, I don't want to go too far away from 1821. Let's shift to 1836, when there was a war for Texas independence against Mexico. You may know that story from your textbooks that talked about the Alamo and the battle at the Alamo, and how Sam Houston was able to defeat Santa Anna, and then the state of Texas became a republic. It was not a state. The War for Texas Independence in 1836 helped to take Texas away from the Mexican government, where they did not want to comply with the Mexican government's edicts and desires for them not to have slavery in Texas, to their independence to be able to have slaves in Texas. Stephen F. Austin wrote a letter to his brother telling him that Texas must be a slave state. And the reason it had to be a slave state was because of the desire of the colonists to get rich from the growth of cotton, just like what was happening in the other southern states, including Virginia, the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. So now Texas is late on the scene, and with the with their success in winning a war against Santa Anna and becoming an independent republic, then they were able to make their own rules. All right, next slide. Some of my information comes from a final report of research and excavation at the Lake Jackson State Archaeological Landmark, and that's in Lake Jackson, Texas. The principal investigator, whom I got to know, was Joan Few. Dr. Joan Few was a scholar at the University of Houston Clear Lake. She was responsible for the first antebellum symposium that was held in Brazoria County at the courthouse in Angleton in 1994. And because of my success with the musical I Am Annie Mae, which is a Texas story based on the oral history of Annie Mae McDade Prosper Hunt, she had heard about that and asked me to come and be one of her special guests for that day. I didn't know then nearly what I know now, but this report, this final report on her investigation of the Lake Jackson plantation, has taught me some things that I will never forget, and some of them I will share with you. Next slide. Joan Few was able to present this map that you're looking at now. We're going to look at it for a minute. This is a map of 45 thriving plantations in Brazoria County. All right, let's start at the top there. You will see the Brazos River. Plantation number 1, that was the Bingham plantation. Then you see plantation number 2, I believe was the Retrieve plantation. And then you see 3, 4, 5 on down, and you come on down, you see Oyster Creek. But notice that all of the plantations border the water. In other words, their front door had to border one of these waterways, whether it was the Brazos River, Barner Creek, Oyster Creek, or the San Bernard River. And if you come on down to the bottom, you will see number 45. I learned some years later that this map does not include all of the thriving plantations. In fact, there were over 60 thriving plantations, some of which are not on this map. Next slide. And now those numbers that we just looked at, 1 through 45, are the names of these. These are the names of the persons who owned those plantations. As I told you, number 1 was the Bingham plantation. Number 2 was the Darrington plantation. And if you will look at where I have the orange circles, these are the plantations that I have had the privilege to study their a lot of their archives and their history in particular, like the Shenango Plantation, the Patton Plantation, which is now the Varna Hogg Plantation in West Columbia. The look on the right side, you see the Retrieve Plantation. Then there's the Levi Jordan Plantation. The Levi Jordan Plantation and the Varna Hogg Plantation are now some of the key Texas Historical Commission historical sites where you can go and learn a few things about plantation. Unfortunately, there is a woman who is on has embarked upon a campaign to take certain books out of the plantation welcome centers that feature what slavery was like. So I'm not sure what you will find there, but if you go to the Varna Hogg Plantation, which is number 19 on this map, because that land was owned by the Pattons before it was owned by Governor James Hogg and Ima Hogg, whom you may have heard of. I am featured in that welcome center doing a video representation of the Sarah Ford ex-slave narrative. And someone who visited there, I think a couple of months ago, said that that video is still in their welcome center. I have taken people on plantation tours, particularly to the Levi Jordan Plantation and the Patton Plantation, because of my familiarity with the stories there. And I'll just tell you that at the Patton Plantation, Columbus Patton and his family purchased that land from Martin Varner, the first plantation owner. And Columbus Patton had a concubine or wife, as you might say, if they had had any kind of legalese, who was an African woman from Kentucky. She was his partner when that house was built at the Varna Hogg Plantation. You may want to visit there at some point because it is a pretty fair representation of what a plantation was like without mentioning too much about Rachel Patton, because the reason that the plantation is now called the Varna/Hogg Plantation is to erase the history of Rachel, who was the partner of Columbus Patton. So that's kind of how, over the years, certain pieces of history has been erased or left out of the historical record. Now you will see number 24, the Retrieve Plantation. Well, Abner Jackson owned 3 plantations. He owned number 2, Darrington. He owned Retrieve, number 24, and he owned number 32, Lake Jackson Plantation. He was one of the larger landowners in Brazoria County. But this archaeological investigation was made principally on number 32, the Lake Jackson Plantation. I also want to call your attention to the Mims Plantation, which is, let me see what number. The Mims Plantation,
9.
number 29. Okay, next slide. Now what you see is like the slave census for 1860 and how the enslaved owners were divided according to how many slaves that they had. If you just had, say, 26 slaves, then you would be an owner. You wouldn't even be in the planter category until you owned, say, like David G. Mills, who owned 192 slaves at Lowwood Place, or 120 at Bynum Place, or him and his brothers had more than 3 plantations. They had 3 plantations in Brazoria County. And then you will see here under the major planters in Brazoria County in 1860, those who had between 300 and 500 slaves owned, as they reported it, and then those who had 200 to 300 slaves owned. Abner Jackson is in that category, and Hosea Bell. And then you'll see those who own 100 to 200 slaves in the last category. All right, next page, please. Reading from that first paragraph, many planters grew both cotton and sugar in the Brazos River Valley area. The amount of intensive labor required throughout the year for both crops required a large labor force. For sugarcane, planting began in January and February. The fields required extensive drainage canals and ditches to prevent standing water in the fields, which caused the roots to rot. Keeping the fields well drained was a year-round job because sugarcane in Texas ratoons. And what that means is that you can take a little bitty plant of it and it will multiply itself. And then going down to where I have highlighted with yellow, about 13 pounds of raw sugarcane would yield 1 hogshead of sugar and 2 to 3 barrels of molasses. You may say, what is a hogshead? It's a barrel. It's a barrel. And a barrel had to be made by someone who was a skilled cooper. That was a skill to be able to make a barrel, which was called a hogshead for the shipping of the sugar. Most planters kept their mills going 24 hours a day until all the sugar was processed. And this is when in October, when the harvest began, about the middle of October, the cutting of the cane and processing of the sugar started. And then their mills were going 24 hours a day until all of the sugar was processed. And then that last paragraph talks about the cotton was also labor intensive. Cotton fields were prepared in January and February, and the cotton was planted in March. These plants had to be hoed and tended until harvest time. Cotton would start blossoming in May. In June, the cotton gin had to be made ready for the harvest, and the storage buildings had to be repaired. Baskets had to be made for the July harvest. Because of the time-consuming task of picking, ginning, and baling cotton, the cotton was sometimes picked when the bolls opened and then stored, okay? And I'll talk more about this intensive process as it relates to Juneteenth and why the Texas enslaved persons were the last to be emancipated. Next page, please. Included in Joan Few's archaeological investigation report is a calendar for every month of the chores that the enslaved people were expected to do. I will remind you that these people were enslaved. Their work was not compensated in any way. And I've gone through these calendars and looked at the tasks that they were required to do to see how many of them pertain to cotton and how many of them pertain to sugar. And then, of course, they had to grow corn because that was the basic crop of grain that they used for food. And they also had to grow any kind of vegetables. If you look at the end of the January calendar, you will just see where they planted peas, sage, beets, lettuce, and mustard seeds. But every other chore or two has something to do with the cotton. Okay, the next page, please. This is more of the inventory. As you can see, this is the estate of Abner Jackson, who had 4,428 acres of land, the value of which was $60,000. You can see that he had 335 acres in cotton, 230 acres in cane. He had corn and how many bales of cotton, how many hogsheads of sugar, 4,000 bushels of corn. And then along with the inventory of the tools and the crops, next page, please, there is the inventory of the enslaved people and the animals. You have the blacksmith tools, the plantation tools, 1,500 head of cattle, 56 mules. And then you have these enslaved people and the following Negro slaves who are only known by their first names, their ages, and the value of them. The younger they are, the more valuable they are. But even the 5-month-old baby is worth $100. The value of that baby will grow as he gets older. There is Charles, who's 1 year old now. He's worth $150. And then there is 2-year-old Emma, who's worth $150. But then as you get old, like Lucy Harry, who's 60 years old, her value has increased and decreased. And now she's worth $250. Next page, please. This is still inventory belonging to Abner Jackson. Remember, he had 3 plantations. So then he had 3 groups of slaves, 1 group for each plantation. Next slide, please. And this is the bank of the San Bernard River, where there was African Landing, a known place for disembarking of smuggled slaves onto the San Bernard River. It's one of the places that Monroe Edwards, who was a notorious slave trader, disembarked his slaves. He is known to have disembarked a slave ship on the bank of the San Bernard at African Landing one night, in the middle of the night, demanding all the naked slaves to get off, and then setting the boat on fire to try to cover up the fact that he has traveled these people to his farm at Shenango when the transatlantic slave trade was supposed to have been illegal beginning in 1808. It was supposed to have been illegal in Britain in 1807, but Stephen F. Austin didn't get here until 1821. So there was slavery into Texas clear up to 1859. Next slide, please. And this is the story of the Johnson family, whose history begins with Demido Johnson, and it has been traced back to 1839 when Demido, along with another group of African slaves, were smuggled to Brazoria, Texas, the Mims plantation. This would be Joseph Mims. The story begins with James W. Fannin, Jr., who settled at Belasco in 1834. You may recall James Fannin from the notorious Fannin Street that's just east of Main Street in downtown Houston. It was a well-known fact that Fannin was engaged in slave trading from the time he arrived in Texas, and his goal was to become wealthy by capturing slaves in West Africa and smuggling them to Texas by way of Cuba. Cotton was king in Texas at this time, and Texas farmers had potential to make more money in the cotton industry if they could produce more and harvest at a very low cost. Fannin had the answer: smuggle slaves to Texas farmers and sell them to support economic growth in Texas. That is the subject of this presentation, my sisters. The growth of economy in Texas. Improve the profit margin for the farmers. After strategically planning to improve his economic status, James Fannin Jr. became partners with Joseph Mims in a plantation which overlooked the San Bernard River near Brazoria, and Fannin's role in the partnership was to furnish slaves to his plantation. You may go to the next slide. And here is more probate records, the amount of money that the estate of Abner Jackson was worth when he was deceased. I may tell you that I have one of my plays in my book, Go Down Ohana, is the saga of the Jackson plantation when that occurs. It occurs during the Civil War also, and many of the planters were absolutely broke financially after the Civil War. They had lost access to their cotton crops and their sugar because the Union confiscated whatever they could find that was left. They had lost some of their slaves to the Union Army. And after the Civil War, though, the workers had to be paid. Probate documents give this account of what John Jackson paid a male and female worker on the Darrington plantation in 1866. And you can see here that payment to Mundy Pinckney made 180 days at 50 cents a day came to $90. 366 pounds of cotton at 50 cents per 100 pounds came to $1.83, and 26 days and 9 nights of sugar rolling. That person was paid $15. The total was $170.33, and deducted was $93.70 because they were charged for everything. The seeds, the clothes, any tools, any broken tools that, next slide please, that needed to be repaired. While in the meantime, the cotton crop was still king in Texas. There was some decrease in the amount of cotton while the enslaved people were freed after Juneteenth. But then the system that was put in place to regain those profits was called sharecropping. And if you've never heard of it, sharecropping is the landowners then share the proceeds of the crop with the freed people. But as you could just see what happened to Pinckney in that previous slide, they never broke even, and they never made enough money to be able to support their families. Next slide. This particular slide shows the route of the Columbia Tap Railroad. If you look at the very bottom and go up from the Brazos River to Columbia, the Columbia Tap Railroad was built by the enslaved in 1854 through 1856. And it was actually built both ways. It came from Houston down toward the Brazos, and it went up from Columbia east of the Brazos, and it met somewhere in between. But the important thing about this railroad is that it was necessary to build the railroad to transport the cotton and sugar from the Brazos Valley, because many of the rivers were becoming the sand was banking them up. Not to mention that it took too long to travel on the rivers, and then the railroads were necessary. So next slide, please. This is a photograph. It is not an artist rendition of the port of Galveston, which was the largest cotton port in the world at that time. The largest amount of cotton grown in America was grown in Texas by enslaved people. And 80% of the cotton that was grown in the world was grown in the United States of America, in the southern states, in the Confederacy, by enslaved people. Next slide, please. This is a story that has not been told, is not known, and will never be told if certain powers that be have their way about it. They don't want this story in the textbooks. They don't want this information circulated, and they would like for me to forget it. This is not an artist's picture. This is a photograph, and you can look at it and tell who is doing the work. Next slide. I'm almost near the end, but I just want to say with this picture, which breaks my heart, that whole families were enslaved to pick cotton. Next slide. I'm nearing the end. Next slide. And now I want you to know about this article, how Britain buried its history of slavery and how the cotton that was exported from the United States and from the coast of Texas, Galveston in particular, was bound for places like Liverpool and Manchester. And next slide, please. And Manchester claims to be the first city that called itself Cottonopolis, which is a way of saying city of cotton. It claims to be the first city that can say we're the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The estimated production in the area of Austin's original colony increased from 600 bales in 1827 to 2,000 bales by 1833. And the Nacogdoches district exported an estimated 2,000 bales in 1834. It just goes to show you how slave labor was the key to this cotton culture. And Texas could have been settled without slavery, but not in the most immediately profitable way. Next slide. And this shows the growth of the slave population in Texas from 1846, 30,505, to 1853, less than 10 years, mind you, it has more than doubled to 78,306. And if you'll just go over to 1861, the population of the enslaved persons in Texas was 169,166. And I can guarantee you, if that is what was reported, it is far less than what was really here. Next slide, please. And this is the story of Manchester and how it became the first city that claims to have been the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. And I want to stop here because, next slide, let's go to the end, because I want to allow you an opportunity to ask me any questions. If you've never read the Texas Ordinance of Secession, then I suggest you read it. I also suggest you read the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, even though Juneteenth was in June 1865, the Congress did not ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution until December of 1865. And there's a clause in there that says you can be free unless convicted of a crime. Next slide. And that particular clause is what, next slide, opened the way for convict leasing. And then between 1866 and 1869, I just included these 4 maps to show you how quickly the Ku Klux Klan grew in Texas to control the civic governments, the municipal governments. The top left shows how many counties were governed by the Klan. And in just, 3-4 years, you can look at the bottom right and see how Texas became almost especially governed by the claverns of the Ku Klux Klan. Next slide, please. And this is where Cunningham and Ellis had at least 300 convicts from the Huntsville prison to support the sugar cultivation of Fort Bend County. Next slide, please. I did considerable work with the Sugarland 95, and that's a story that is still evolving. And let's just go to the end and let's see what kind of questions we have. My archive of of slave history of cotton and sugar, of plantations, is quite vast. And I have endeavored to make sure, let's back up one.
Okay. This one?
It's important that we know about the semi-sesquicentennial, the one after that, right there. The semi-quincentennial commission that will be celebrating the 250th birthday of the United States in 2026. That's 250 years past 1776. Just be aware that those plans have been on the drawing board now, I think, since 2016. And I am open to any questions you may have. Please keep them short. I'm interested in what you may have to say.
So Naomi, are you ready for me to stop sharing?
Yes, you may stop sharing.
Okay.
Thank you, Janice.
Yes. If there's you can unmute yourself. Everyone can do that. And let's just see. Why don't you, if you are showing your screen and you want to speak, why don't you raise your hand and I'll call on you, or let's see if that works. And if not, we'll try another way. Any questions or comments?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
You want me to move it?
I think it might show you better.
Oh, okay. I just wonder when, if it was included in the Emancipation Proclamation, that it was no longer illegal for Blacks to learn to read.
That is an excellent question, and I am so glad that you asked it. It was, of course, illegal for Blacks to read and write during enslavement. After they were freed, if they were going to learn to read and write, they had to teach themselves, or they had to have an opportunity that may have been provided for the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, for its brief time in Texas, because the Union soldiers that were appointed to man the bureaus, many of them were shot, many of them were run out of town. So by 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau in Texas was almost non-existent because the Klan had run them away. So learning to read in Texas took a grassroots effort. And I will say that there were some missionaries that came from the North, that were called carpetbaggers, of course, who did help with the organization of schools. But if you really want to learn what that process was like, you need to read about George T. Ruby, who was one of the first legislators, Black Reconstruction legislators in Texas. Him and Reverend Matthew Gaines of Washington County. George Ruby actually worked 3 different counties: Fort Bend, Brazoria, and Galveston. And Reverend Matthew Gaines was from Washington County. He is the one who spearheaded the motion to get Prairie View become a land grant college in 1876, a land grant college, as well as he did a lot of campaigning for public schools in Texas for both Black and white children. So public schools in Texas was a grassroots effort. But what happened with many of the freed people, and to your question, it was ma'am, it was never legal to teach Black children to read. It's still not legal to teach Black children to read. And the reason I know is because on Monday of this week, I was assigned to read a book to 110 second graders. that had an awful hard time even sitting still for me to read a book. And many of those children in the second grade could not read. And I will tell you that private prisons are built in Texas based on third grade reading scores. And I will also share with you that I worked with HISD and the NAACP for so many years to try to increase the literacy of African Americans in Houston Independent School District, which was the 7th largest school district in America at that time. So the literacy director quit. And at the public schools here in Texas, they are mostly, especially in the cities, I can't speak for the rural areas, they're mostly populated entirely by brown and Black students. And Black students are not being taught to read even today because no one understands the language that they speak, which is not the King's English. It is not standard American English. It is African American English. And that is one of the reasons why very intelligent, educated Black people say this, that, these, them, and those instead of this, that, these, them, and those, because the TH sound is not prevalent in any African languages. And so it is an African cultural transition. It's a cultural transition that the TH sound is just difficult for many Africans unless they have been helped with that. And I can say that with the way that incarceration of African American peoples is increasing, especially with the school to prison pipeline, the people who are in prison are illiterate. And if you are illiterate, that is exactly where you're going. You won't be able to buy a car or apply for a mortgage. I hope I answered that question as professionally and as gracefully as I could. All right, next question, please.
Here's another question. Just go for it. Jackie?
I do. Thank you, Naomi, so much for this presentation, this eye-opening and necessary information. I taught in a school in Fort Bend County and also docented at the DeWalt Heritage Center, which was based on the Du Brother Company. And it used freed slaves to enslave people as the sharecropper kind of system. But I taught at a school called Scanlon Oaks, and it was in the neighborhood of Sienna Plantation, who until about 5 years ago actually took the name Plantation off the neighborhood because that's what the development was called. Do you have any experience with the Scanlon Plantation when it was in operation there in central Fort Bend County?
I can't speak about the Scanlon Plantation, but let me speak about Fort Bend County, which is where the Sugarland 95 were unearthed in the spring of 2018. Fort Bend County is one of 4 counties that were known to be the Texas Sugar Bowl. That was the counties of Brazoria, Fort Bend, Waller, and Matagorda. They are all, they share borders. And so Sugarland gets its name from the Imperial Sugar Company. The Imperial Sugar Company's first owner was the secretary to Stephen F. Austin, and that's Samuel May Williams. Samuel May Williams has a home in had a home in Galveston that was one of the very few homes to survive the 1900 hurricane. So there's no difference in Fort Bend and Brazoria. All of those plantations were forced labor camps, ma'am. And when the Civil War was over, because the Texas Treasury was broke, they had to capitalize on their major sources of industry, which was steel, cotton, and sugar. So the state took over a lot of those plantations. For example, Retrieve in Brazoria, which is now a prison on that, where that plantation once was. Darrington in Brazoria. There are several prisons in Fort Bend that were once plantations. In fact, where the Sugarland 95 were unearthed, Reginald Moore had been a prison guard in his earlier years when that was Central Prison, owned by the state of Texas. Cunningham and Ellis were two of the sugar planters who leased their workers from the Huntsville Penitentiary. So you could say that slavery went full circle in Texas. It went from some persons being enslaved to being emancipated. Emancipation is not slavery. It can be given or denied. The Emancipation Proclamation was an announcement. It was not a law. And Juneteenth is a holiday. Let's get that straight. It's just a holiday. But the 13th Amendment is a law. And it says you can be free unless convicted of a crime. So as many persons as could be convicted for whatever were convicted because the labor was needed. And let me just say this about Juneteenth. When Gordon Granger came into Galveston to announce emancipation for the Texas enslaved, along with him had to come an army, and many persons in that army were former United States colored troops. But when he came, he told the people, you are free. You're no longer slaves. You don't have to call the landowner master anymore, but don't go anywhere. Stay put. Now, what kind of freedom is that? And in June, that cotton is still ripening in the fields. It needs to be harvested. This is the major source of the gross domestic product for the United States of America, is cotton at that time, Juneteenth, 1865. Are there any other questions? We don't have all night, I know.
One more question, if I may.
Yes.
Sure, yes.
I'd like to know that if after the 13th Amendment, when the slaves were freed, and of course they had no way of employment except what they were doing, picking cotton, were then the plantation owners required to pay them?
Well, it was the job of the Freedmen's Bureau to help issue and ensure contracts between the employers and the employees. But then there was a lot of chicanery going on with that. For example, a family or several families might be quote unquote employed to be sharecroppers on, say, Johnson's farm over here. But once the crop is harvested, then Johnson could pay the Ku Klux Klan to run the people off. Mm-hmm. So the people don't get nothing, you know, or set the crop on fire, or set the house on fire with the people in it. Because in my Reconstruction book, which is not published yet because the University of Texas Press, who published my first book, said that we don't want nothing like that, Naomi. There was so much violence at the end of the Civil War. The war was not over in Texas, even at the surrender. In fact, there were 16,000 United States colored troops that fought the last battle of the Civil War at Palmetto Ranch Battlefield, 14 miles from Brownsville. And those soldiers were kept in the army and not released until July 1867. I apologize to you for the passion with which I tell this story because there's a lot of trauma inside of me.
I love it. Please,
Very clear and very understandable.
Well, Janice knows that. And my job is to tell the story. One of the quotes that I remember is that we perish for a lack of knowledge, but what about this one by W.E.B. Du Bois? Either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy America.
I think it's already happening.
it's happening. I want you to know that I know, and a lot of people in this room know, that nobody is free until we are all free. And I feel very passionate about that. So
Thank you.
for your passion.
To say like thank you to the people for the Friends of the Library, the Nesbitt Library in Columbus. We see one little square on our screen here that says Nesbitt Library. The whole
And I'm thrilled that you're here from the library. I mean, I know Columbus. I go through Columbus on my way to Hallettsville, but I'm thrilled that each of you are here. I just hope in closing that there is something that I have said that you will share with someone, because until we can erase some of this ignorance, it is going to destroy us. I just also have heard people quote that you may forget what someone said, you may forget what they did, but people never forget how you make them feel. And I hope that there is something that I have been able to share with you through the grace of Janice's invitation to a group of women that I really have come to love, the League of Women Voters, and what you're doing. It is up to us to be the change we want to see. And we have work to do. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Naomi. How can we say thank you enough?
Great.
So this will not be the last time we're together and learning more and learning from you, learning together. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And Naomi, just wish I could just give you a big hug right now. So thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're at the end of our hour. So just have take this with you. And as Naomi said, please share something of tonight with someone else. And we are the change. The change is going to come from us. It's up to us. And that's a heavy load, but we're up for it. So thank you, Naomi.
Night, ladies. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Come see us in Columbus.
I will.
All right.
I will.
Okay, great.